It was rush hour. The streets were packed, cars lining up one after another, impatient drivers weaving between lanes, trying to get ahead. The world was its usual blur of noise and motion. And then, out of nowhere, a small dog darted into the middle of the street, right in front of the oncoming traffic. For a split second, it seemed like any other stray, lost and confused in the chaos of the world. Drivers slammed on their brakes, their horns blaring, but the dog didn't budge. It didn't run off in panic. Instead, it stood there, frozen in the middle of the road, blocking the cars, refusing to move. People shouted, drivers honked, some even got out of their cars, unsure of what to do. But the dog just stayed there, its eyes focused on something ahead, something none of them could see. And in that moment, the question everyone asked wasn't why the dog was there, but what was it protecting? What could possibly be so important that this animal, a creature most would overlook, was willing to risk everything? Stay with me, because the answer will leave you speechless, and it's a story that'll change how you look at loyalty, love, and bravery forever. The street was no longer just a street. It felt like a stage set for something far bigger than any of them could imagine. The air was thick with tension, a quiet hum that crawled under the skin. The once familiar hum of rush-hour traffic was now distorted by the sudden stillness. Even the cars seemed to hold their breath, engines idling, as if they, too, were unsure of what was unfolding before them. Above, the sky was a dull gray, an overcast that mirrored the heavy silence in the air. The trees lining the sidewalk swayed, their branches whispering secrets that no one was listening to. Every few moments, a gust of wind would blow through, sending a chill down the spine, a reminder that something was about to break the monotony of the morning. And then there was the dog, standing perfectly still in the middle of it all. Its fur ruffled by the wind, its body tense but unmoving. It didn't bark. It didn't panic. It just stood there, eyes fixed on something in the distance. And it wasn't just a dog now. It felt more like a sentinel, guarding a secret, waiting for something, waiting for someone. The drivers, all frustrated by the delay, glanced nervously at each other, but no one moved. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, as if the very street itself had frozen in time. What was happening? What was it waiting for? There was an unease that no one could shake, a quiet dread that told them the calm was only the beginning of something far more unsettling. The scene was chaotic, yet there was a stillness to it. The traffic had stopped, but not for long. The drivers' impatience turned to frustration, their eyes locked on the small dog in the middle of the road. The horns blared louder now, voices yelled out of rolled-down windows, but the dog remained still, unbothered, as if the noise and anger around it didn't exist. A woman in the car closest to the dog leaned out of her window, her face contorted with frustration. "What the hell is this dog doing?" she muttered, tapping her fingers on the wheel. "Move already, you stupid mutt." She slammed her hand on the horn again, but the dog didn't flinch. A man in the next car, older and more cautious, watched the scene unfold. His heart thumped in his chest. There was something about the dog, its eyes. It wasn't acting like an ordinary stray. He could feel it, too. There was a quiet intensity in the air, a feeling that something more was going on than just a lost animal. But he couldn't place it. "Call animal control," the man said, his voice soft, almost unsure. "Something's not right." Before anyone could move, the sound of sirens sliced through the air. A police car had arrived, its blue and red lights flashing as it screeched to a halt at the edge of the street. The officer, a young woman with short hair, got out quickly and approached the scene. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes scanning the dog, the crowd, the stalled traffic. She seemed ready to take control, but when she saw the dog, she hesitated. There was something about the way it stood there that made her pause. The officer knelt down slowly, trying to make herself less threatening. "Hey, little guy," she said gently. "What's wrong? Come on, move out of the road." But the dog didn't respond. It didn't even glance at her. And that's when it happened. Out of the corner of the officer's eye, she saw something. Just a glimpse, a flash of movement on the sidewalk. It was quick, too quick for anyone to notice. But it was there. A flash of color, something small, barely visible beneath the shrubbery on the edge of the sidewalk. The officer's pulse quickened. She turned her head, eyes narrowing in on the spot. Her instincts told her to investigate, to follow the sudden gut feeling she had. "I'm going to check that out," she said, her voice firm, but her eyes never leaving the spot where she had seen the movement. The woman in the car, still watching the dog, shouted, "You're not going to get that dog to move. It's just a stray, probably hungry or lost." But the officer ignored her. She walked toward the bush, her boots crunching on the gravel. As she approached, she noticed the faintest of trails, small, almost unnoticeable marks in the dirt. Something was hidden there. The officer crouched down, brushing aside the branches, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, in a sudden, heartbreaking moment, she found it. A tiny bundle, no bigger than the palm of her hand. A baby, a newborn, barely more than hours old, wrapped in a dirty blanket, shivering and fragile. The officer froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know how the baby got there, but the realization hit her like a wave. The dog wasn't just blocking traffic. It wasn't just standing there because it was lost or scared. It was guarding this tiny, vulnerable life. Her hands trembled as she gently lifted the baby, wrapping it more securely in the blanket, looking around in disbelief. She glanced back at the dog, whose eyes were still locked on her, unwavering, as though watching her every move. There was no time to waste. The officer's mind raced. What kind of twisted fate had brought this baby into the street? And why was this dog standing guard? Was this a coincidence? Or was something far more sinister at play? She quickly stood up, cradling the baby in her arms as she rushed toward the police car. Her thoughts swirled, and doubts began to creep in. What had the dog known? What was the connection between the two? Could she even trust what was happening right now? But there was no time for doubts. She had to get the baby to safety and fast. "Get back in your cars," the officer yelled, her voice hard now. "Everyone needs to stay back. This is an emergency. No one move." The crowd reluctantly began to pull back, still staring in confusion and disbelief. But the officer didn't stop. She rushed to the car, her mind focused entirely on the fragile baby in her arms. She jumped into the back seat, the baby cradled against her chest, her hands shaking. As she closed the door, she caught one last look at the dog, still standing in the middle of the street, eyes never leaving her. It had done its job. It had protected what no one else could see. The officer's heart ached as she looked down at the baby, tears welling up in her eyes. What would have happened if that dog hadn't intervened? Would anyone have noticed the baby in time? The thought was almost too much to bear. But there was more. She knew there had to be more. What was the story behind this child? Who had abandoned it? And who was the dog that had come from nowhere to save it? As the police car sped off toward the station, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary rescue. The bond between the dog and the baby, it felt too deep, too meant to be. The story was just beginning, and there were answers waiting to be uncovered. The police car tore down the street, its sirens blaring, but the officer could barely hear them over the pounding of her own heartbeat. She glanced down at the tiny baby in her arms, swaddled in the blanket that barely seemed to protect it from the chill of the morning air. Its tiny chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, still so fragile, so small. But there was a feeling in the pit of her stomach, a growing unease, that something wasn't right. The dog had known something. It had stood there like a sentinel, blocking traffic, refusing to move, guarding that baby. There was no way it was just a coincidence. No way the dog, some stray left to roam the streets, had been in the right place at the right time. But who would do something like this? Who would leave a newborn baby in the street, hidden among the bushes? As the car sped down the road, the officer glanced into the rearview mirror. She saw the dog standing motionless in the middle of the street, its eyes still fixed on the car. It was as if the dog knew something that the officer didn't, as if it understood the situation far better than anyone else in the world. The officer shuddered and turned away, refusing to look back. Her mind was already racing, already trying to piece together the mystery. "Something's not right," she muttered to herself. The officer felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. It was a text from her partner, Ben. His words were short, to the point. "Get to the station. We need to talk. Something strange is going on here." Her stomach churned as she read the message. She hadn't told him yet about the baby, about the dog, about the weird sense of urgency that had led her to the bushes. Ben wasn't one for superstition, but there was something about this case that felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were just beginning to scratch the surface of something far darker than either of them could understand. As the car pulled into the station, the officer's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. It wasn't physical. It was an emotional weight, an overwhelming sense of dread. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew that the feeling was tied to the dog. That dog. The officer stepped out of the car, still holding the baby tightly against her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the situation pressing on her shoulders. She needed answers, but everything felt so off. Ben was waiting by the door of the station, his expression unreadable. He didn't move as she approached, didn't say a word. His eyes locked onto the baby in her arms, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, with a glance toward the car, Ben spoke in a low voice, almost as if he were talking to himself. "Why did you bring it here? You should have taken it to the hospital." The officer froze. His words stung like ice water, and for the first time since she'd found the baby, doubt crept into her mind. "I couldn't leave it there," she replied, her voice shaking. "You didn't see what I saw, Ben. The dog, it was guarding the baby. There was no way it was a coincidence." Ben narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "You're telling me that a stray dog knew to protect a baby? Come on, you know how ridiculous that sounds." The officer opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, the baby's tiny hand twitched. Her breath caught in her throat. The baby was alive. It was breathing, it was moving. But why did she feel so uneasy? Why did everything about this feel unnatural? Before she could say anything more, the baby made a soft sound, a weak cry. Ben's face softened, his posture loosening for just a moment. He looked down at the baby in her arms, his eyes clouded with confusion. "We'll get it checked out," he said, his voice gentler now. "But something about this, about everything that's happening, feels wrong." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the station's open door, sending a shiver down their spines. It wasn't normal for wind to pick up so suddenly, especially in the middle of a calm, quiet morning. The officer looked up at the sky, seeing nothing but pale, wispy clouds. The air felt thick, charged, as though something was building up just beneath the surface. Then the lights flickered. The officer and Ben exchanged a glance, both feeling it now, an eerie, unsettling tension that filled the air. The flickering lights seemed to amplify the feeling, making the station seem colder, darker. The weight in the officer's chest grew heavier. "What the hell was that?" Ben muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "This place is haunted, or something." The officer shook her head, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. "We need to focus. The baby," but before she could finish her sentence, the radio on the desk crackled to life. The static was loud, garbled, almost like someone was trying to speak through a storm. Ben's eyes widened as he reached for the receiver. "Ben, no," the officer began, but it was too late. He spoke into the radio, his voice low, but the words he spoke froze the blood in her veins. "Who is this? Can anyone hear me?" The static grew louder. Then a voice that was not human, spoke through the radio. "You should have listened. You should have stayed away." The officer felt her blood run cold. Her heart raced in her chest, and she turned to Ben, but he was just as stunned as she was. Before they could react, the radio went silent. The lights flickered again, and then, just as quickly as the moment began, it was gone. The room was still, too still. The unease, the strange feeling that had been building in the air, now hung over them like a suffocating cloud. "I don't like this," the officer whispered, clutching the baby tighter in her arms. "None of this feels right." Ben didn't respond. He couldn't. The unease was too real, too tangible. And in that moment, both of them knew it. Something was coming. The station was dark. The only light came from the flickering bulbs overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch longer and longer, as if the very air was bending under the weight of what was to come. The officer clutched the baby tightly to her chest, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The baby's tiny hand trembled against her skin, its breath still shallow but steady, alive, against all odds. And yet, something about this moment felt wrong. Too wrong. Ben was beside her, his expression hard, his jaw clenched. He looked down at the baby in her arms, then up at the shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. The strange voice from the radio still echoed in his head. "You should have listened. You should have stayed away." And now, as if on cue, the doors to the station slammed open with a loud bang, causing both of them to jump in shock. "Is anyone here?" A voice called out, but it was not one they recognized. The officer and Ben exchanged a nervous glance, both of them instinctively moving closer to each other. Slowly, they turned their heads toward the source of the voice, but there was no one there, just the cold, empty street beyond the station. Yet the air was thick with a sense of impending doom, the kind that made every hair on the back of their necks stand on end. The officer moved toward the door, trying to peer out into the early morning mist. Something caught her eye, a figure moving in the distance. It was just a shadow, a silhouette against the pale gray sky, but there was something about it that felt familiar, and yet she couldn't place it. The figure moved with a fluidity that was unnatural, almost as if it wasn't quite human. And as it drew closer, the officer's heart began to race. It wasn't just the figure that caught her attention. It was the look in its eyes, the same intensity that had been in the dog's gaze, the same knowing. Before she could react, the air around them seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. And then, a flash. The officer gasped and stumbled back, shielding her eyes as a sudden light filled the station, blinding her for a moment. When the light faded, everything was still. Too still. The figure was gone, but something else had changed. The baby was no longer in her arms. She looked down in shock, her heart lurching in her chest. It was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign of where it had gone. In that moment, every second of time seemed to stretch out, as if the world had frozen around her. Her mind was spinning as she turned toward Ben, whose face had gone pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ben didn't answer. He was staring at the center of the room, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak but unable to form words. His hand pointed, trembling, toward the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, stood the dog. The same dog, the one that had blocked traffic, the one that had guarded the baby. But now, its eyes were different. They weren't just guarding anymore. They were watching, searching, waiting for something. And in its mouth, the officer noticed something that made her blood run cold. The baby. The dog stood motionless, the tiny form of the baby gently cradled in its mouth. Its eyes locked with the officer's, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. The officer's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her hands reaching out as if to take the baby from the dog. But then, the dog growled low in its throat, a warning, and for a split second, the officer hesitated. The energy in the room was thick with tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. She could feel the presence of something beyond this world, something ancient, something powerful. This wasn't just a dog. It was a protector, a guardian sent to deliver a message, to save a life. She knelt before the dog, her voice soft but firm. "Please let me take it." The dog's eyes softened for a moment, as if it were weighing her words, and then, as quickly as it had come, the dog released the baby into her arms. The officer held the tiny form close to her chest, her heart pounding in her ears as she looked at the dog one last time. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt a deep sense of gratitude, of reverence, toward the animal. The dog had done its job, had protected the baby against forces neither of them could fully understand. But there was still the question of why. Why had the baby been left there, in the street, and why had the dog intervened? What had it been guarding the baby from? And what did it all mean? The officer turned to Ben, who was still standing in stunned silence. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you think this is over?" The officer didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the baby, still alive, still breathing, but the mystery of it all remained unsolved. The air around them seemed to grow heavier once more, the oppressive tension lingering in the room like a storm that hadn't yet passed. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think it's over." As she turned to leave, the sound of a dog's bark echoed through the empty station, distant but clear. It was a single bark, a warning, or perhaps a final message. The officer paused, taking one last glance at the dark corner of the room where the dog had been. The presence of something unexplainable lingered, and she knew deep in her bones that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that neither she nor Ben could possibly comprehend. But for now, they had the baby, and for now, that was enough. As the officer walked away from the station, the baby still cradled in her arms. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. The world outside was still, quiet, almost too quiet, and yet, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. She looked down at the tiny life in her arms, fragile and innocent, and wondered what kind of force had intervened to protect it. The dog's eyes, the way it had watched, waited, and then released the baby, had held something ancient, something that went beyond simple instinct. It was as if the dog had known that this child was more than just a child. It was something worth protecting at all costs. But what was the true meaning of that moment? The officer's heart ached with the unanswered questions that still lingered. Why had the baby been abandoned in the first place? And who or what had the dog been guarding it from? She had always believed that the world was logical, that everything could be explained. But today had shattered that belief. There were forces beyond her understanding, forces that moved in the shadows, beyond the veil of everyday life. Forces that were sometimes gentle, like the touch of a dog's protective gaze, and other times, inexplicably powerful. With each step, the weight of what she had witnessed seemed to grow heavier. The questions piled up, unanswered, and the mysteries stretched further into the unknown. But for now, there was one undeniable truth she could hold on to. The baby was safe. In that moment, the officer realized that sometimes protection comes in forms we don't expect. In shadows, in silence, and in the quiet bravery of those who guard without asking for anything in return. Perhaps that was the message the dog had been sent to deliver. That sometimes we are saved not by answers, but by the love and protection that surrounds us, no matter how unseen it may be. And with that thought, the officer carried the baby into the uncertain future, ready to face whatever came next, but forever changed by the mysterious forces that had shown her the true meaning of protection and sacrifice. What do you think drove the dog to protect that baby, even at the risk of its own life? Was it simply instinct or something more? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you were moved by this story of unexpected bravery and love, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming and suspenseful tales. We've got many more stories that will leave you questioning the world around you. So be sure to stay tuned for our next emotional roller coaster. Join our growing community and never miss a moment of these unforgettable stories. Until next time, keep your hearts open and keep watching for what comes next.